Hello, and welcome to Grand Dukes of the West, Episode 43, The Burgundian Union. We've been focused on France for the past few episodes, but with Joan of Arc now come and gone, it's time to return to the Low Countries and focus on the growing Burgundian Union. When we last left the Low Countries, the Treaty of Delft had just been signed, which marked the end of the conflict between Philip the Good and Jacqueline of Bavaria. The Duke of Burgundy was victorious, and his rule of the counties of Hainaut, Holland, and Zeeland was now firmly established and basically uncontested, even though Jacqueline was still allowed to call herself the Countess. But the Treaty of Delft was just one step in the process of integrating Hainaut, Holland, and Zeeland into the Burgundian Union, and it was neither the first step nor the last step. Thus far, we've been focused on the political narrative of the conflict between the cousins, but now let's zoom out a little to explore how it all came together. The seeds of the Union had been planted by Philip the Good and Jacqueline of Bavaria's grandfather, Philip the Bold. The double wedding of 1385, which joined the houses of Burgundy and Bavaria together, and the wider alliance it sealed, began a period of unprecedented cooperation between Flanders, Brabant, and Hainaut, Holland, Zeeland. Apart from a few fairly minor disagreements, the years between 1385 and 1419 saw these territories acting in ever closer concert. The close relationship between these three polities in the Low Countries was reaffirmed in 1405, when John the Fearless, his brother Anthony of Burgundy, and his brother-in-law, William of Bavaria, entered into an official alliance. This treaty of alliance was the natural result of the earlier close relationship between the princes' fathers, and, at the time, it seemed that the future of the Low Countries would be one dominated by a Burgundian-led dynastic union, rather than a Burgundian-led personal union. But then, everything changed when the Fire Nation attacked. When a combination of personal disagreements, ambition, and partisan conflict led to John the Pitiless usurping Holland and Zeeland from his niece. The self-proclaimed Count and later Ruvart of Holland had been a close Burgundian ally in the past. He had led soldiers on behalf of both Philip the Bold and John the Fearless in France, and John the Fearless fought the Battle of Outy primarily to protect John the Pitiless's power in Liège. But the prospect of seizing power in Holland was too tempting to resist. Now obviously, John the Pitiless didn't just enter a perfectly content Holland and say, "Can I be Count?" The County of Holland was in the midst of a decades-long partisan struggle between the Hook and Cod factions. The Hooks had the upper hand while William of Bavaria ruled as Count, but with his death, the Cods decided to try and upend the situation. John the Pitiless could thus ally with the Cods and use their resentment towards William to press his claim above the claim of William's daughter Jacqueline. In response to this threat to Jacqueline's inheritance, the Duke of Burgundy arranged for John IV of Brabant and Jacqueline of Bavaria to marry each other in order to shore up her position and to secure the Burgundian hold on her counties. And if all had gone smoothly from there, the Low Countries would have continued to be dominated by a Burgundian-led dynastic union, just now with two poles rather than three. However, everything did not go smoothly, and that's putting it lightly. John IV of Brabant failed to protect his wife's counties, and the marriage between John and Jacqueline was a disaster, once again putting it lightly. Jacqueline ended up fleeing to England, repudiating her marriage to John IV, and marrying the English prince Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, all while John the Pitiless continued to strengthen his hold on Holland. The failure of the marriage between John IV and Jacqueline, in my mind, began the transition of the Burgundian project from a dynastic union to a personal union. Jacqueline's quest for an annulment and her marriage to Humphrey threatened to remove her counties from the Burgundian dynastic union, and this could never be accepted by Philip the Good. Faced with the threat of English encroachment into his backyard, Philip's strategy began to shift towards consolidation under his rule. In all honesty, John IV of Brabant was most likely happy to let his wife go. He was less happy to lose control of her lands, but he probably viewed the whole situation as a net neutral, maybe even a net positive. But John IV was not the leader of the Burgundian project. Philip the Good was, and he resolved to stop Jacqueline and her new husband by any means necessary. The Duke of Burgundy had supported the Hookes while Jacqueline and John IV were still living together, but with the Countess's flight to England, Philip switched sides and began to lend his support to John the Pitiless and the Cods. Upon the death of John the Pitiless, Philip inherited both his personal territories in Holland and Zeeland, and his leadership of the Cod faction, both of which would be instrumental in Philip's eventual acquisition of Holland and Zeeland. Philip's personal territory in Holland and Zeeland provided him with a local power base, and the prospect of reuniting that territory with the communal domain helped him push his claim to be accepted as count, as we'll explore later on. That being said, the support of the Cod faction was the more important part of the inheritance of John the Pitiless. Thus far, I've focused on the conflict between the cousins, with the conflict between the Hookes and the Cods kind of in the background. But I want to emphasize that, if anything, the conflict between the Hookes and the Cods was the primary one, and Philip the Good can be considered the beneficiary of a Cod victory, just as much as the Cods were beneficiaries of the Burgundian one. Wim Blockmans and Walter Prevenir write that Philip's, quote, victory had come about because of the wealth of resources upon which he could draw, by his astute diplomacy with the towns of Holland and Zeeland, and by the support of Bedford. On her part, Jacqueline's Hook power base proved inadequate, and her masculine allies unreliable. More fundamental was the deep division into two warring factions in Holland and Zeeland, which had resulted in a rift extending through all strata of society. These divisions offered a made-to-order power base for any strong opponent of the legitimate count. Philip's alliance with the Cods gave the Duke of Burgundy a vital pillar of support in the county, without which his victory in Holland and Zeeland would not have been possible. While the Duke of Burgundy did raise soldiers for, and fund a good portion of, his campaigns in the north, the contributions of money from the Cod-aligned towns of Holland and Zeeland, and men from those towns' militias, should not be ignored. This was not a Burgundian conquest of Holland and Zeeland so much as the victory of the Cods in a Dutch civil war. But while the victory belonged to the Cods as much as it did to Philip, it would be the Duke of Burgundy who succeeded in establishing his dominance in the county. Philip did empower the Cods throughout his conflict with Jacqueline, and while he ruled Holland and Zeeland more generally. But after the Treaty of Delft was signed, the Duke of Burgundy worked to establish peace between the factions once more, and both Hook and Cod would be subject to Burgundy. The Duke of Burgundy made sure that both Hooks and Cods would be represented in the Council of Holland, although the Cods would hold more seats. Under Philip, the Cods did enjoy the increased influence they had sought for years, but the Hooks would not be disenfranchised. However, as Philip consolidated his hold on the northern counties, the Hooks and Cods were joined by a third group, which proved to be the most powerful: Burgundian officers and court officials. Men who had not grown up in Holland and Zeeland, and so were both neutral with respect to the factions, and primarily loyal to Philip. By the end of 1425, a number of Burgundian and Flemish officers had taken up residency in Holland, and, of special note, the treasurer of the county was a Fleming. The next year, Philip appointed a Brabander, a Frenchman, and a Fleming as his joint governors in the county. Bit by bit, the Duke of Burgundy was installing his own men in Holland. They joined the comital administration, the comital council, and they were installed with garrisons in the cities and castles of the county. Before the Treaty of Delft was even signed, Burgundian officers dominated the administration of the county, and Dutch tax revenue began to make its way into Philip's coffers. And Holland was not the only place to receive Burgundian agents. As Philip the Good strengthened his hold on Hainaut, Burgundians made their way into that county as well. And Burgundian officers had had a place in Brabant since the days of Anthony of Burgundy's tenure as Duke. But Philip would not only rely on officers from Flanders and Burgundy. He also made sure to extend his patronage to the local nobility, and these groups should not be seen as mutually exclusive. For example, the Lalande family had one foot in Flanders and another in Hainaut, so when Philip the Good was looking to appoint a bailiff in Hainaut in 1427, Guillaume de Lalande was a natural choice. Philip made this appointment as he was consolidating his hold on Hainaut after the death of John IV of Brabant. While John IV lived, the Duke of Brabant claimed Hainaut by virtue of being Jacqueline's husband, and the Duke of Burgundy thus ruled Hainaut through an agreement with his cousin. But once he died, Philip needed a new reason to hold power in the county. The actual reason Philip gave didn't really matter as much as how he gave that reason. Philip the Good made his case to the Estates of Hainaut, the county's representative body, and it was due to the acceptance of the estates that Philip was able to effectively rule in Hainaut. Robert Stein writes that the estates, quote, held the key to provincial power. They determined the fate of the Burgundian claims to the hereditary succession, and, even after the takeover, they were of crucial importance for the further expansion of Burgundian power. Through the cultivation of allies in the counties, appealing to the estates, and his own resources, the Duke of Burgundy was able to triumph over Jacqueline of Bavaria, and that triumph was sealed in 1428 in the Treaty of Delft. After the treaty was signed, Philip and Jacqueline toured together through several of the towns of Hainaut, Holland, and Zeeland, to make sure that everyone knew what the deal was. Jacqueline was still their countess, but Philip held most of the real power. Still though, at least initially, the countess did have some say in government. Her counties were to be officially ruled by a regency council made up of 9 members, 6 to be appointed by Philip, and 3 by Jacqueline. And the countess was to receive a portion of the revenues of the counties. I'm not exactly sure how much she was getting, but if I had to guess, I would say it was more than she received when she was holed up in her corner in southwest Holland, but less than enough to properly hold court. I come to that conclusion because a few months after the Treaty of Delft was signed, it was amended, in exchange for giving up her minority share of the Regency Council and her direct share of the revenues from her territories. Jacqueline was given an annual payment of 24,000 écus. In an interesting turn of events, Philip kept the administration of Hainaut, but in 1430 turned around and leased Holland and Zeeland to Frank, Philip, and Floris, the lords of Borselen, for a period of 8 years. I'm honestly not entirely sure why the Duke of Burgundy gave up his hold on the counties after his tireless pursuit for them, but it likely had to do with the intense debt that the counties were in. The lords of Borselen were very wealthy and were owed much out of the coffers of Holland and Zeeland, so by leasing the counties to them, Philip could start working to balance their accounts. Moreover, now that there was little threat of the English or another dynasty coming into Holland, the Duke of Burgundy didn't need to necessarily run the day-to-day affairs of the counties, and the lords of Borselen were firm allies of the Duke of Burgundy. They had served him well in his conquest of Holland and Zeeland, and were important leaders of the Cod faction, so they could be relied upon to look after Philip's interests, right? There are 2 versions of how the mortgage of Holland and Zeeland to the lords of Borselen played out, and they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. The first one is that Philip the Good learned that Frank von Borselen and his cousins were taking more than their fair share out of the revenues of Holland and Zeeland. And, due to this corruption, they were unable to pay both Philip and Jacqueline the full sums owed to them in the terms of the mortgage. So, in 1433, he returned to the counties and arrested Frank. Around the same time, Jacqueline, ever short on money, and increasingly so after a few years with a reduced pension, officially relinquished her title as Countess of Hainaut, Holland, and Zeeland to Philip, along with the debts attached to those titles. The other version is that Frank and Jacqueline fell in love when the Lord of Borselen was in Zeeland. The 2 were secretly married in the summer of 1432, and were able to enjoy each other's company for a few months before Philip the Good learned of the marriage. According to the Treaty of Delft, Jacqueline was not allowed to marry without Philip's permission, and she certainly did not have that. The marriage was a dangerous prospect for Philip. For one, Jacqueline was only in her early 30s at this point, and could still conceivably get pregnant with a child who could threaten his dynastic plans for the Low Countries. Furthermore, Frank von Borselen was a powerful noble with much influence among the Cods. Their union had the potential to unite the factions of Holland in favor of a more local dynasty. If Jacqueline and Frank got married for politics, they posed a serious threat to the Duke of Burgundy. So the Duke once more leapt into action to secure his hold on Holland and Zeeland. He came north and arrested Frank before the couple could move against him, demanded that Jacqueline abdicate from her counties, and threatened the Lord of Borselen with execution. Jacqueline, desperate to save her husband's life, then agreed to abdicate. When all was said and done, regardless of what happened in the lead-up, in April of 1433, Jacqueline officially relinquished all claim to Hainaut, Holland, and Zeeland, and Philip the Good became the Count of all three. Frank von Borselen was then released from prison, and the mortgage that the Borselens held for Holland and Zeeland was ended. Whether or not the couple had already secretly wed, we do know that Frank von Borselen and Jacqueline of Bavaria did get married, with Philip's approval, in early 1434, now that the Duke of Burgundy was firmly in control of Jacqueline's former counties. We don't know for sure how her fourth marriage went, but honestly, I like to imagine that it was a happy one. So many of her troubles were linked to her husbands that I think she deserves at least one good marriage. We do know that she did receive a further increased stipend from Philip the Good to maintain her lifestyle for the rest of her life, even if it was a fairly poor compensation when compared to the counties of Hainaut, Holland, and Zeeland. But the rest of her life would not be long, as Jacqueline of Bavaria died of illness in 1436. Frank von Borselen would outlive his wife by a few decades, and continued to serve the Duke of Burgundy throughout the rest of his life. While the secret marriage story is definitely a bit more compelling than corruption and money problems, there's no contemporary evidence for it. We only really know that Frank was arrested by Philip in 1433, and that Jacqueline handed over her counties shortly after. The later 1434 marriage does indicate the existence of some attraction between Jacqueline and Frank, but the fact that Philip allowed it to take place at all seems to indicate, to me at least, that the secret one in 1432 did not, as does Frank's continued career in Burgundian service. When Philip the Good officially became the Count of Hainaut, Holland, and Zeeland in 1433, he was adding those titles to an already expansive list. He had begun his career as the Duke of Burgundy and the Count of Flanders, Artois, and Burgundy Palatine, but had since added the County of Namur and the Duchies of Brabant and Limburg to his domains. We've already touched on Namur, but to sum it up, Philip purchased the right to inherit the county from its heavily indebted count in 1421, and later that year, the Duke of Burgundy convinced the estates of Namur to accept the deal. The Duke of Burgundy then nominated 22 of his officers to make for Namur as fast as possible upon hearing word of the Count's death, in order to prevent anyone else from making a claim to the county. And when the Count of Namur died in 1429, Philip was accepted as the new Count without incident. Brabant was a more involved affair, but admittedly less involved than Hainaut, Holland, and Zeeland, though. We last left the duchy in 1427 with the death of John IV and the elevation of his brother, Philip of Saint-Pol. At first, relations between the two Philips were good. Philip of Saint-Pol had served the Dukes of Burgundy, first his uncle, then his cousin, for years, and Philip the Good was happy to have a more effective leader in charge of Brabant. The new Duke of Brabant even made his cousin Burgundy his official heir to the duchies of Brabant and Limburg in a will published in late 1427. However, the cordial relationship between the cousins was not to last. Although it never got as bad as Philip the Good and Jacqueline's relationship had, Philip of Saint-Pol was not as content to be led around by the Duke of Burgundy as his brother was. That being said, the real source of tensions between Brabant and Burgundy was Philip of Saint-Pol's search for a wife. As part of the Duke of Brabant's mission to hew a more independent course from Burgundy, the prince decided to form a marriage alliance with the House of Anjou, and in 1428 he was betrothed to Yolande of Anjou. This was unacceptable, to say the least, to Philip the Good. In fact, the only marriage that was more unacceptable to him was likely Jacqueline's marriage to Humphrey of Gloucester. I'm sure that at this point, Philip saw the possibility of Brabant becoming his one day, and he likely didn't love the idea of his cousin having children who could inherit the duchy instead of him. But what really set the Duke of Burgundy off was his cousin's choice of bride. The Angevins were fierce supporters of the Dauphin, who had also married into the family, and so this match would have made Philip of Saint-Pol the brother-in-law of Philip's main enemy in France. There is also a personal element to Philip's disdain for the Angevins. His sister, Catherine of Burgundy, had been betrothed to Yolande's older brother Louis back in the 1410s. But Yolande's father had broken off the betrothal and sent Catherine back to Burgundy after the Cabochard revolt, to the embarrassment of Catherine. This insult enraged John the Fearless so much that years later, during a round of negotiations with the Armagnacs, the Duke of Burgundy swore to forgive all of his enemies in the kingdom apart from the Duke of Anjou. Philip the Good shared his father's hatred of the House of Anjou and was furious that his cousin would seek an alliance with them. The chronicler Georges Chastelain even mentions that Philip was considering going to war with his cousin to prevent the marriage. And while we don't have any evidence supporting that assertion, it does kind of fit into Philip's MO. But warfare would not erupt between Brabant and Burgundy, because in 1430, as Philip of Saint-Pol was on his way to meet his soon-to-be wife, the Duke of Brabant died. The convenient timing of his death led many at the time to suspect Philip the Good of poisoning his cousin, but an autopsy was able to prove his innocence. Now, while Philip the Good had been named his cousin's heir, that did not necessarily mean that he would become the Duke of Brabant and Limburg without a hitch. There were other claimants to the duchies, such as his Aunt Margaret, and princes who could claim descent from the older ducal line. Furthermore, the King of Germany, Sigismund of Luxembourg, once again tried to pry Brabant and Limburg away from the House of Burgundy. So, as with Hainaut, Holland, Zeeland, and Namur, the Duke of Burgundy appealed to the estates of Brabant to support his claim to the duchy. After about 2 months of weighing their options, the estates decided to go with Philip the Good, and the new Duke of Brabant swore to agree to the terms of the Joyous Entry of 1356, an agreement between Duchess Joan of Brabant and the estates, which served as the charter of government for the duchy, and has been occasionally termed the Magna Carta of the Low Countries. With the definitive acquisition of Brabant by the senior House of Burgundy, the great, unfulfilled ambition of Philip the Bold had finally been achieved. Over the course of the 1420s, the realm of the Duke of Burgundy had ballooned to encompass much of the Low Countries. And this expansion was largely done through diplomatic means. Sure, I've had a few episodes focusing on Philip's military conflict with Jacqueline of Bavaria, but really, that can be boiled down to 2 campaigns against English forces and an intervention into a civil war, more so than a conquest. The key to Philip's hold on Hainaut, Holland, and Zeeland was not his military forces, but his alliance with the Cod faction and the support of the estates. Robert Stein writes, quote, "The recognition of the position by the subjects was crucial for the establishment of Burgundian power. It was not the formal rules of hereditary law, not the enfeoffment by the emperor or king, and not even the financial transactions that formed the basis of Burgundian power. The key lay in the fact that the subjects, or at least the political elite that was represented in the representative institutions, were prepared to accept the dukes as their lord. Much more so than popes, emperors, or kings, it was the subjects who determined whether or not the rights were valid." So now let's explore what the Duke of Burgundy had to offer his new subjects. Right off the bat, there were the impressive finances of the Burgundian State. Now, you might recall that for a while I've been talking about how stressed those finances were. So you might be under the impression that the resources actually weren't that impressive. But we need to consider the fact that for over 2 decades, the Dukes of Burgundy had been fighting an intense civil war in France, one that basically bankrupted the French state. And while the French treasury had financed much of the Burgundian faction, hence the aforementioned bankrupting, the war still did come with a hefty price tag for the dukes. No other French prince, and very few other European princes, could have supported their own faction in the same way. And it is telling that the coalition of Armagnac princes was never able to overwhelm the forces of the Duke of Burgundy. The financial resources of the Dukes of Burgundy were closer to the level of kings than counts. Flanders alone produced more ordinary revenue than the Union of Hainaut, Holland, and Zeeland, and that's before taking into account the various aids that the dukes managed to wrangle from the members of Flanders. And in addition to simply controlling multiple rich territories, the Dukes of Burgundy had one of the most sophisticated financial systems of the time. Modeled after the financial apparatus of the kings of France, the system of Burgundian receivers, chambers of accounts, and auditors made sure that the dukes knew how much money they had, how much money they should have, and how that money was being spent. Review episode 11 if you want more information on that. Now, this wasn't a perfect system, and both irresponsible spending and graft certainly still existed, but it was miles better than what most of the other princes of the day had to work with. The financial system set up by Philip the Bold did just as much to lead to the Burgundian envelopment of the Low Countries as his tireless diplomacy, which led to both Anthony of Burgundy becoming the Duke of Brabant and the double wedding of 1385. The exploitation of the opportunities created by the latter would not have been possible without the resources provided by the former. The importance of the wealth of the Dukes of Burgundy to the success of their territorial expansion really cannot be overstated. It allowed Philip the Good to purchase the right to inherit the county of Namur. It allowed him to pay fee rents to lords and officers throughout the Low Countries, and it allowed him to finance the war for Hainaut, Holland, and Zeeland. And the wealth of the Dukes of Burgundy did more than just facilitate their acquisition of the Low Countries, it also made a case for accepting them. The ruling dynasties of Brabant, Namur, and Hainaut, Holland, Zeeland were all deeply in debt, and this was a problem for the inhabitants of those territories just as much as it was for the prince. The Hook and Cod Wars had seriously damaged the comital finances of Holland and Zeeland, and to make matters worse, the counts were already running annual deficits before those costs were even added. Brabant, too, was deep in the red before the Burgundians ever stepped foot in it, and the wars of Anthony of Burgundy for the Duchy of Luxembourg and John IV for Hainaut, Holland, Zeeland only worsened the situation. I maintain that John IV was a poor ruler, but his position was only made worse by the fact that the finances of his office were in shambles. When his much more capable brother took over, he found that there was little that he could do, and Philip of Saint-Pol's time as Duke of Brabant centered on his desperate attempts to keep his head above water. One of the main expectations of a prince was to act as an economic center for their territory, and their spending and patronage was a major economic driver. So, an indebted prince that could not afford such spending and patronage was a real dampener on their principality's economy and on that principality's prestige. Furthermore, the late Middle Ages saw the beginnings of a change in how rulership was thought of. Now the princes were beginning to be seen as the stewards or managers of their territories, rather than the owners. Therefore, a ruler's debt was not only their problem or their family's problem, but a problem for the whole principality. This debt could especially be a problem for the merchants of a territory. As, in the Middle Ages, it was a fairly common practice for princes to seize the goods of merchants if those merchants came from a territory ruled by a lord who owed them money. And the scramble to escape from debt could be just as damaging as the debt itself. A prince could try and pay off their debt in a few different ways. They could raise taxes, they could manipulate the coinage, or they could sell their possessions, and each of these methods came with issues of their own. Taxes were never popular, and if raised too much, they could cause real hardship for the populace, or even spark a revolt. Furthermore, the prince usually needed the consent of the estates or some other representative body to raise new taxes, or to levy special one-off taxes or aids. And that was sometimes hard to get, and could come at the cost of serious political concessions. Coinage manipulation tended to be the go-to of the financially desperate prince, and if done slowly and carefully, the negative effects of it could pass mostly unnoticed. However, when too much silver and gold was skimmed from the mints, or the precious metal was spread too thin, the coinage lost its value quickly. This could lead to several issues. People who drew a fixed salary from land, feudal rights, or office would see the purchasing power of that salary drop significantly, and for those involved with trade, foreign goods became ever more expensive, while domestic goods lost their value. And when princes were really desperate, they would sell off or pawn their feudal rights, lands, and other possessions. This practice had the potential to begin a dangerous spiral, which could lead to financial ruin for both prince and principality. For if a prince sold off their rights and possessions for immediate funds, going forward, their income would be reduced, thus forcing them to keep selling off more and more to cover their short-term needs while their long-term cash flow evaporated. And the pawning often became selling in all but name, as a financially desperate prince could rarely scrape together the funds to redeem their pawned lands. And as the prince sold off or pawned more and more, their lenders and those who bought their goods had an increased influence at court. The unpopularity of the influence of these lenders sparked a revolt against John IV of Brabant, and almost caused another against Philip of Saint-Pol. As the conception of the principality became more public, the disposal of lands and rights was seen as an existential threat to the principality as a polity. When these indebted princes did manage to secure extra taxes from the estates, often those taxes were granted with the expressed instructions that the prince must buy back whatever lands and rights they had sold off before they could use the money for anything else. And in both Holland and Brabant, one of the conditions attached to the acceptance of Philip the Good's claim to rule was that he redeem and reunite the county and duchies sold off or pawned lands. And here, Philip's inheritance of John the Pitiless's extensive personal estates in Holland provided yet another reason for the county to accept him as its ruler. I could go on, but really you all already know that a bankrupt state is bad news. So, the wealth that the Duke of Burgundy had, as well as the fact that he was really the only solvent lord in the Low Countries, made a solid case for accepting his rule. And the fact that many of the debts in the counties and duchies in the Low Countries were being financed by merchants and bankers based in Bruges only strengthened the appeal of the Duke of Burgundy. Philip the Good would raise taxes, and we saw how that kicked off the revolt of the Kennemerlanders in Holland. But in general, this was done with the cooperation of the estates, and the relative sophistication of the Burgundian financial apparatus meant that a smaller portion of those taxes would go missing to graft. Furthermore, the Flemish groot was by far the most stable currency in the Low Countries, and the prospect of a political union with Flanders meant that a currency union would also be possible. Such a union would both stabilize the coinage in the other territories and make regional trade easier. This was not an innovation, and attempts to establish currency unions covering various Low Country territories had been made throughout the 14th and early 15th centuries. We've already seen one currency union between Brabant and Flanders during the time of Philip the Bold, and more recently, John IV attempted to establish one for Brabant, Hainaut, and Zeeland. However, neither of these unions, nor any of the other earlier ones, lasted long, as financial difficulties and political issues got in the way. But the prospect of joining with Burgundy meant that many of those issues could be avoided. Such a currency union could be directed from the center rather than organized by coalition and committee. The wealth of the Dukes of Burgundy and their proficient financial administration meant that a united currency would likely be stable and reliable. This was at the forefront of the minds of many as Philip the Good made his case to the people of Brabant, Hainaut, Holland, and Zeeland. In fact, when the estates of Brabant accepted Philip the Good's claim to be the heir of Philip of Saint-Pol, one of the conditions for that acceptance was for a currency union with Flanders to be established. And the Duke of Burgundy made similar promises to many of the towns of Holland and Zeeland as he courted their support. When Philip came to power in Brabant, Hainaut, Holland, and Zeeland, the Flemish groat did begin to circulate much more in those lands. But that would not be the extent of the currency union. In 1434, a new coin, the Vierlander, was introduced in the Burgundian Low Countries. The name, literally, Voorlander, refers to Flanders, Brabant, Hainaut, and Holland, the territories which officially minted it. But the coin would be used throughout the whole Burgundian Union. The introduction of the Vierlander was an important step on the path towards the unification of the Low Countries. Not only did it tie the various territories to the Duke of Burgundy, but it also tied them to each other. The Vierlander and the Burgundian Union allowed for the economies of the Low Countries to be linked closer than ever before. And this linking of economies, especially the better access to the Flemish market which came with it, was yet another tempting prospect of union with Burgundy. The sheer size of the cities of Flanders and the population of the county provided a natural destination for many of the goods produced in the Low Countries, especially the grain of Hainaut and the beer of Holland. The prospect of a political and currency union facilitating that trade made for a powerful economic motivator. The Burgundian political union would prove to have significant economic ramifications and would reorient the economy of the Low Countries more inwards. Not to get too ahead of myself, but Holland, which had once been a part of the Hanseatic League, would emerge as a rival to it, and as tensions between the Duke of Burgundy and the English rise, the trade across the Channel will begin to dry up. And, going the other way, the economic union would also encourage closer political relationships. Joint meetings of the estates of Flanders, Brabant, Holland, and Hainaut began to be called on a routine, if irregular, basis to oversee the minting and distribution of the Vierlander. Their discussions, while focused on monetary issues, were not confined to them, and as joint meetings of the estates became a more common practice, they became a convenient place for the Duke of Burgundy to address representatives from his various territories all at once. Other, earlier meetings of multiple estates were an uncommon but not unheard of occurrence. A 1427 meeting of the estates of Flanders, Artois, Picardy, and Hainaut was focused on organizing Philip's takeover of Hainaut, and a 1431 meeting of the estates of Flanders, Brabant, Holland, and Zeeland was dedicated to discussions on the ever-important cloth trade. But, once the Vierlander was introduced, these kinds of joint meetings of estates occurred with a much higher frequency. We should keep in mind that these meetings were made up of representatives from separate territories under the rule of the same lord, rather than representatives from different parts of a single political unit. But, over time, the meetings of the estates of Flanders, Artois, Brabant, Hainaut, Holland, Zeeland, etc., began to morph into what would become the States General of the Netherlands. This was a long and not entirely straightforward process, but by the 1460s, the seeds of the States General had certainly been planted. But if a single representative assembly was in the making, a single administration was not. As Philip the Good works to establish his rule over his new lands, we do not see Hainaut and Flanders combined, but what we do see is the creation of parallel administrations. Philip the Good more or less took the system of government organized by his grandfather, Philip the Bold, and extended it to his new counties and duchies. Now, over the decades, changes and reforms had been made, but by and large, it was the same system set up in the later 1300s. Comital and ducal councils were organized in the new territories and run by governors, regents, and stadtholders. Laws and justice were handled on the county and duchy level, and while the duke had a hand in the governance of all of his territories, day-to-day affairs needed little to no input from the center. However, if the administration of Philip's lands was kept separate, the finances of the Burgundian state could not be entirely siloed. Philip followed the now established Burgundian tradition of loving luxury, and his household was ridiculously expensive. But even apart from that, the court and the other various demands of state, war, and diplomacy required ever-increasing sums of money, and an interregional financial administration was needed to raise and keep track of those funds. Once again, the Duke of Burgundy followed in the footsteps of his grandfather, Philip the Bold, and extended the Burgundian financial system to his new territories. The systems of local and regional receivers and chambers of accounts were brought to Brabant, Hainaut, Holland, and Zeeland, and now Brussels became a financial administrative center to go along with Lille and Flanders and Dijon and Burgundy. Over time, Philip the Good would experiment and innovate with the financial system, especially at the center. But, at least initially, what we see is a series of parallel but still separated financial institutions being spread to the new members of the Burgundian Union. Some form of centralized oversight came from the receivers general and the chambers of accounts at Lille, Dijon, and now Brussels. But the money still had to flow from the local to the regional to the principality level before it reached that stage. A receiver in Zeeland could not request funds from Hainaut, but if Zeeland needed to repair a dike, for example, they could request funds from the Duke, who could order the Chamber of Accounts in Lille to send over money for that repair. Money which could have been sent over by Hainaut's receiver general. Just like with the joint meetings of estates, over time the central financial administration of the Burgundian Union would become more established and official. And this was important as it allowed the Dukes of Burgundy to more effectively draw on the financial resources of their various wealthy territories. The auditors of Dijon, Lille, and Brussels needed to be in close contact with each other if the Burgundian state was to remain solvent, and it is to Philip's accountants' credit that it did. So, while the Burgundian Union was still in its infancy, some of the important hallmarks of it had already been established. Joint meetings of estates, parallel administrations, accountants and audits, and a shared coinage all set the stage for a closer union going forward. However, that closer union was still not inevitable. There was still much work to do in order to tie the new Burgundian territories together and to create a Burgundian identity to go along with the more regional Flemish, Brabander, and Hollander identities. So next time, we're going to look into a few ways that Philip the Good attempted to create that identity through his marriage to Isabella of Portugal and his creation of the Order of the Golden Fleece. Thank you so much to my patrons, with an extra thanks to my newest patron, Olivier, Comte du Serre, and to Christine, Duchesse de Namur, Peter, Duc de Brancion, Elliot, Graf von Kravenstein, Anthony, Comte de Chateauneuf-en-Auxois, Preston, Comte de Saint-Fargeau, Mark, Comte de Meursault, Diana, Graf von Beersel, Mehmet, Comte Santerre, Chris, Comte de Semur, David, Graf von Bornum, Rosa, Comte de Germol, Elliot, Comte de Bussy-le-Grand, Quentin, Graf von Blasfeld, Tyler, Comte de Chamaret, Ian, Graf von Arenberg, Eric, Comte de Couche, David, Graf von Barland, Jonathan, Comte de Bazoches, and to my Knights of the Duchy. If you want to join them, you can at patreon.com/ValoisBurgundy. If you want to support the podcast in other ways, you can do so by leaving a review in your podcast app of choice and telling your friends about the show. Both really help to grow the show and will earn you my everlasting appreciation. If you want to keep up with the show, you can follow me at Valois Burgundy on Twitter or Blue Sky, or find Grand Dukes of the West on Facebook. You can also email me at granddukesofthewest.com and check out the podcast website for maps, images, sources, and more at granddukesofthewest.com. Once again, thank you for listening.